Hi, good evening, welcome. Let's go ahead and get started. I'm very excited to see all of you here. Thank you so much for coming. You'll hear the words from my mouth, thank you a lot tonight. Thank you again to you for coming, but also a lot of people to thank. But before I get there, let me introduce myself. My name is Matthew Cook. I'm the head of Unique Collections and Scholarly Communication at the Broome Library here at Channel Islands. I do have the best title in all of librarianship. Thank you. I concur. It's a fantastic title. My business card I hand out willingly and with great delight. So one of the things that I think distinguishes our library is the fact that we think of ourselves as a digital teaching library. And when we think about our digital collections, we know that they are hard to serve but research-rich materials. And we're less concerned with the object, as say some other special collection libraries that I worked at, and we're more concerned with their use. Will they be utilized in the classroom? Will teachers employ them for their instruction? And ultimately, do they help students learn? That's really the only reason we would have special collections. And so we treat these materials first and foremost as opportunities. And we welcome opportunities to share with our students the kinds of materials we have in unique collections, and that includes this exhibit tonight. This exhibit draws from a partnership we have with the E.P. Foster Library in Ventura County, in Ventura City. Does anyone know the E.P. Foster Library? Raise hands, that's great. I have to be honest, we don't own the materials that you'll see tonight in our exhibit. We have digitized them for the E.P. Foster Library. And I think this speaks to our desire to not necessarily create a bunch of documents that reside in our basement, rather create collections, in this case digital collections, that again our students can use in their studies. So it's my hope that you'll not only enjoy our presentation, but also enjoy our exhibit, and maybe think about using these collections in any discipline that you might be here at CI, from ESRM to English to even chemistry. And I do want to bring out one special component of that relationship we have with the E.P. Foster Library. In addition to the images they have at their library that we digitized, they also have a long-running collection of the newspaper called Voz. It's a Spanish language newspaper that was published in Oxnard from about 1926 to, Odette, do you know when the publication was?
1927 was the first one, I believe.
1927 was the first one. Do you know when it ended? 1932, thank you. Do you want to finish this presentation? So, Voz is a Spanish language newspaper in Oxnard, published from 27 to 32. And Odette is one of our student workers. We digitized that entire run of that newspaper. Now she's working on translating it and making it full text searchable in English. And in fact, we have some reproductions of Voz in our exhibit. So not only do we have the national press and the international press tradition of this, reported in many different newspapers. We also have a Spanish language local newspaper. I think that's really exciting. And we wouldn't have had access to that collection, without our partnership with E.P. Foster. So I'm very excited about that partnership. And I hope you are as well. So exhibits like this are not possible without the efforts of many people. And I have to start with the two most important people. I have the great privilege of working with Laura Warden and Kayla Casey. They're two extraordinary librarians, and they deserve all of the credit for making this happen. The exhibition, indeed the exhibition series, our idea of showing unique collections once a semester, drawing your attention to them, they were their ideas, and I'm thankful for their vision, their dedication, their talents. So thank you, Laura, and thank you, Kayla. I'm honored to be representing their work. The only reason I'm up here is because they're too shy to address you, and that's why I'm up here. Also, I should say I am much more handsome than either. I also think that's a very funny joke. We have a lot of support in addition to Kayla and Laura. I want to thank Ryan Rush and Evelyn Taylor, who work in unique collections. They work diligently to preserve and make accessible our analog and digital collections. Debbie Hoffman is in charge of public service, and thank her for supporting us and frankly paying for this. Thank you, Debbie. Marco Ruiz for his equipment support. Thank you, Marco. Monica Pereira for creating our map. Odette De Jesus, who is right there, who you've already met. Odette, I'd like to give you she's been in for 4 years. And I don't know Ben Hippel, thank you for helping us filming it. I need to thank Jessica Sandrock, and I also need to thank Ricky Maxwell. Oh, and last, Sarah Martinson and her student Ray Besides for helping us with the event setup. And of course, more importantly, Amy Wallace is the boss of all of us, and she deserves special recognition not only for her leadership and grace, but also, and probably especially, for putting up with us. Thank you, Amy, and thank you to Martha Reyes. So I am honored to introduce our featured speaker. It's Dr. James Snead. Dr. Snead got his BA at Beloit College in Wisconsin. Does anyone know Beloit College? I'm fond of Beloit. They hired my band when I was about 22. They're also it's also the alma mater of Colleen Delaney, one of our teachers, you know, Colleen's. And Dr. Snead went on to do his graduate work at UCLA with his MA and PhD. Sorry? Sorry? Yeah, great. We're Dalton now, you're not at Broome. So I've stolen some text from his website at Northridge. He was raised in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And I still don't know how he got from Santa Fe to Beloit. He's held fellowships at the American Museum of Natural History and the Clements Center for Southwest Research and SMU University. He taught for 11 years at George Mason University. That's significant because that's where I got my master's degree in history. That's the only reason it's significant. Other than that, it's not a significant university. I thought that was funny too. So he's held a research grant from the Warner Grand Foundation for Anthropological Research and the National Science Foundation. He's got support from the Huntington Library, the American Antiquarian Society, the Historical Society of Southern California, and the School of Advanced Research in the Human Condition. The fact of the matter is he's a wonderful scholar, and we should be very happy that he's been here with us. He's involved in 3 current projects. I'm going to start reading to you, and nothing's more boring than me when reading it. I have to. So the first is the Tano Origins Project. This multi-year effort focuses on the cultural landscape of New Mexico's Galisteo Basin in the ancestral Pueblo area. From the landscapes of settlement and conflict in the late 1200s through archaeological survey and excavation. Of particular interest is Burnt Corn Pueblo, a major settlement that was destroyed by fire in AD 1310. I wish we were talking about local. Right. So we're going to be here for 3 hours. He's also involved in the Encountering Antiquity Project. This intensive archival study in the history of archaeology examines the public engagement with antiquities in the 19th century U.S. The MS in Progress uses correspondence maps and drawings to illustrate the complex role that remains of indigenous history in the American landscape in this critical era of national development. I'm really drawn to this because of the interdisciplinary nature of it, and that's one of the things we focus on here at CI. And then last, perhaps this is most relevant, he's also involved in the Forgotten Casualties Project. This new research initiative examines the aftermath of the St. Francis Dam disaster in 1928, which killed as many as 500 people in Los Angeles and Ventura counties and has been largely forgotten. Our work uses archival and archaeological sources to contextualize the dead of this catastrophe in order to better understand their lives and to situate the event in new cultural, social, and historical frameworks. That's indeed why Dr. Snead is here today. I don't know if you know, but this is the anniversary of the St. Francis Dam disaster. What year, sir? 1928? And someone can do the math, and it's the 88th anniversary of this tragedy. 87, 88, or 89th anniversary of this tragedy. So I hope you will join me in welcoming Dr. James Snead. Thank you.
Thanks. The reason there's so many projects on that list is I get bored very easily, right? So I move on. Thanks for coming, and a particular shout out to Colleen Delaney and Jan Carey. Colleen and I had this weird, some of you would remember, we had this strangely paired career. She's a few years younger than I am, but we went to the same undergraduate school and then the same graduate school, and now we're sort of teaching down the road from each other, and she's a great friend. The irony, of course, is she's up in Redding right now at the Society of California Archaeology meetings, so there's a little trickiness there. All right, so I'm going to take about 30 minutes here and talk through some of the aspects of the Forgotten Casualties Project. As Matt indicates, this is the anniversary of this horrific event. When I talk to my undergraduates about this at Cal State Northridge, it's extremely rare for any of them to have ever heard of this. Although, if they were from Ventura, maybe they know a little bit about it. If they're from Santa Paula, maybe they know a little bit about it, or maybe in Santa Clarita a little bit. But in general, for most of us in Southern California, this really is a forgotten tragedy, which is one of the reasons that pulled me into this in the first place. You might think, what's an archaeologist doing talking about a historical disaster in a relatively recent time? Well, I hope to make the case in a minute or two as to why I found it compelling and why we got there. Let's start with this, which is a fragment of an epitaph taken from the Bardsdale Cemetery. Bardsdale, as many of you know, is a little tiny town up here, mostly just a white spot on the road, up not too far from Santa Paula. Those of us who are familiar with, say, Anglo-American gravestones tend to think of them as being sort of generic, name, dates, died, blah, blah, blah. This is basically a Latino gravestone from 1928 associated with, or Latina in this case, associated with the St. Francis Dam disaster. And I put it up there because they use the phrase, con gritos de dolor, which essentially means screams of sadness and pain. And I like that phrase as grim as it is. This is the grave of Maria de Jesus Carrillo and 6 of her children who were drowned in the St. Francis Dam disaster. We sometimes tend to put a little distance between us and these things. It's tragic, lots of people died. I love this phrase, as grim as it is, because I think it brings home the immediacy and the horror in the middle of the night, in a spring evening, suddenly finding yourself struggling for your life in the darkness as your house is washed away by an unimaginable catastrophe. That's what happened to her family. That's what happened to 419 others on that evening. And that's one reason why I think we need to think about this catastrophe. Well, it's all about water, as is everything in Southern California. Now, some of you are working on water projects in various kinds of ways. The theme of water and the need for water and the capture of water is really one of those profound motifs running through European history in the West. It's also about Los Angeles because it's one of the tropes of Los Angeles history. Big city, not much water. What happens next is historic. An issue we're still facing today in so many ways, but has a very, very deep historical roots. And as an archaeologist, years ago, I was involved with things about water and ways that ancestral Pueblo people dealt with water in a scarce environment in New Mexico. And it's sort of interesting how this turns out to be one of the themes of my research, although here, different scale, different place, and it all comes back to water. Well, how do we think about water usually? If you look at it in history, we think about it, particularly in Southern California. We were talking earlier about Cadillac Desert, right? We think about it as either sort of policy issues, macro things, cultural, political things about why we use so much water and who does it, who pays for it, who's behind it, and all that kind of stuff. Big issues, big sort of scalar issues. Or, in LA at least, we look at things like personalities. We had a conversation a few minutes ago about William Mulholland, who was responsible for the Los Angeles Aqueduct. A great story. A guy who, he's a ditch digger. He's a ditch digger from Ireland. He's not educated. He comes over, they put him in charge of digging a ditch in the late 1870s, and by 1926, he's built the aqueduct, he's designed all this stuff, and he's building the St. Francis Dam up by Santa Clarita. Amazing guy, and a tragic ending, if you look at it that way, because he takes the responsibility, whether deserved it or not, for the disaster, and fades off into history. Big park named for him over by Griffith Park in LA. Policy, personality. When we started getting involved in this project, we were really concerned about what was dropping out between those two philosophies. And we were particularly, as archaeologists often are, interested in people. Okay? interested in the human responses to certain kinds of situations. We were interested in the human side, if you like, of the water wars. We're interested in the people who were involved, how they made decisions about things, how they responded to circumstances, how they shaped circumstances, all these aspects that we thought were getting left out by this larger discussion. It wasn't policy, it wasn't really about, the bureaucrats and designers, the architects. It was about the individuals, one by one, who were involved in this process. And here we have, these are a couple of the casualties of the particular disaster. We'll talk about it in a couple minutes. Then this is somebody being buried in the course of that. Life, death, decisions, people, that kind of process. And that's something that is tricky to get at, right? And how do you find people? I mean, one of the great fallacies of historical archaeology is everybody says, isn't it already written down? And the easy answer is no, never. There's lots of stuff that wasn't written down. But also the other question is, if it was written down, where was it written down? And this is where libraries and archives of all kinds of organizations make a huge difference. If anybody here lives in Los Angeles, in the realm of the Department of Water and Power, and knows somebody who pays a water bill in your family, or maybe you or something, this is where he goes to die. It's not the Ark of the Covenant, okay? But maybe, I don't know, maybe that's where they put it. In these boxes are the minutiae of people's daily lives, including, we find out, the minutiae of the people who lived and died and were involved with the St. Francis Dam disaster. That's the kind of record that is hard for historians do use that kind of data, but it's hard for them because it's very, it's massive, there's 40 boxes of this stuff, and archaeologists love this stuff. So we're used to dealing with little tiny bits of old junk, so it's a little bit, and that's okay, right? It's okay to do that. That's one place where we find these people. But we also find them here out in the landscape. This is a picture of probably an old whiskey flask in a construction camp inhabited by laborers who worked on the LA Aqueduct. Lying there on the ground, somebody chucked it away, maybe 100 years ago, still there. Still there in the California desert, evidence for individual actions. This is where archaeologists and their fieldwork come into this equation. Documents, material culture, there are material for trying to get at these individuals, at these people, So that leads me to the Forgotten Casualties Project. It's based in Cal State Northridge Department of Anthropology. It's co-directed by one of my former NA students, Ann Stansel. A lot of the work that I mentioned today is basically Ann's in many ways, so I always have to get her permission to come out and talk about it, and she would rather not talk, so actually it works out okay. So if I don't give her credit at particular points, that's just because I forget. She's really all right. This is you've got a lovely map for this over here. This is the zone of concern. St. Francis Dam itself is in the Angeles National Forest, about 7 miles north of Santa Clarita. It's easy to get up there, although people who drive it by. Francisco Canyon, there's a road that goes all the way up there. That's where the dam is. That's the ocean. This is 54 miles of the trace of the flood. And so in effect, as an archaeologist, that's our site. 54 miles long, 4 or 5 miles wide, depending on the width of the valley. That's a pretty tall order, right, to imagine that. And lots of houses, land, it's a very complicated environment. But that's the universe within which we're working. All right, so I'm going to break this down into 4 or 5 subcategories of the kinds of things that we're doing up there. And where you start, of course, is with the dam itself. The St. Francis Dam was built starting in 1926 because of fears that anarchists were going to blow up the LA Aqueduct farther up the line. earthquakes were also involved because all the reservoirs were north of the San Andreas, and we were worried that you had an earthquake, you would cut the hell off from the water supply. But in fact, this was a time of public agitation up there, anarchists, as they say. Public agitation in the Owens Valley, local folks that believed they were getting kicked out of their water. So the LAWP, instead of resolving that issue in that way, said, we'll just build another reservoir down closer. So if we have problems, in fact, they did blow it up at one point in here and actually used the dam for this purpose. It's a holding tank to keep the water supply out. It gets filled up fairly slowly, then lifted up and drained out. But early March 1928, it's all the way up. Dam leaks a little bit. Apparently that's not so unusual. No one is that worried about it. Well, Holland himself was up there on the morning of March 12th, stands up there, looks at it, says, it'll be fine. The dam fills up, he goes home that night, and gives it away. The whole thing, all at once. It's a little unusual in a dam disaster. I'm not a forensic civil engineer. There's some of them involved in this project. In fact, if anybody's interested, he's coming to talk in Santa Clarita at the end of the month, and I can make sure you guys can get a whole information you want to. Smart, brilliant guy, actually. The kind of guy they bring in for Katrina, these kinds of issues, to explain what the heck went on with those levees. And this is from him. This is, very, very quickly, this is the dam. This is the flood pool. It was a bad place to build the dam. It was a nice little constricted point in the valley, but the rock isn't right. It's what they call a paleo landslide. Don't worry about it. The point was, filled it up, the water soaks up into the rock, and the rock slips. Slips, displaces the water. We were talking earlier, it's like a physics experiment, right? Like a cork. Just pops the dam right out. Just the force of all that, of displacing the water, knocks it out. A couple minutes before midnight, March 12th, 1928. And it's all over. Let me back this up again. And by the time sun rises, that's what it looks like. It doesn't look like that now. Somebody fell off the top of that, a sightseer, a couple of months later, so they blew it up. You go up there, now that's what it looks like. Not very pretty, just a bunch of concrete lying around. The road has been bulldozed, moved around. It's kind of a mess. The dam's down here in the valley. Just this big pile of white stuff, some little roads up there. Not much to look at. Here are some facts, just for fun. 47 million cubic meters of water in the holding tank. The wall of water, immediately, because it all goes at once, so it's all the water at once, 120 feet high in that narrow canyon. Right below the dam, a whole series of installations and a workers' village and things, absolutely obliterated instantly. Again, the flood zone is 54 miles long, 5.5 hours just about. By the time the sun rises on the 13th, it's all over. Now, farther downstream, and if anybody from Santa Paula, there's a little monument in Santa Paula about this, farther downstream, there was a little advance warning. No one saw it, though, because it's dark, and it's in the country. The way that they figure out the time of this is that there are hydro plants along the aqueduct. So the power plant above it, power plant below it. The power plant below it, obliterated. The power plant above it, they're sitting there watching the dials and whoa, something happened, the power just dropped. And they look at it while it stays down, and they go, somebody should go down and see what happened. You got the motion, go down there, and the lake is gone. And in the dark, looking down, the lake is gone. And everybody, all of their friends and co-workers right down the valley are gone. With a couple of exceptions, people climbed way up out of the valley and caught onto a tree and got out, but almost entirely. Our number is 425 total casualties, and that's one of our contributions to this, because particularly Ann Stansel has worked very carefully with the death records and various combined lists, and there's a time it's very hard to do this, years. There's still 100 odd missing from this, right? And over time, lost track of them, who they were, how you know that they're missing. It's rural, people not always know on the books and these kinds of things. Okay, different. But we've got a pretty good handle on this, and the number hasn't budged for a year or so now, so I'm pretty happy that she's happy that that's what it's taking. Although if you look it up online, you'll see all kinds of other numbers. All right, so our first step as archaeologists is go out there and see what it looks like. It's on the National Forest. We don't work on the dam. We don't know anything about the dam. It's dam. I mean, that's why the engineers are doing it. Well, where do we go? Dam's up here. Where we go is downstream, and we do archaeological survey in the riverbed, which means we're basically walking across that landscape and looking for traces of the wreckage. And we do that to try and understand what that landscape looks like, basically. So these are some of my CSUN students who have been making some maps, getting ready to go see what's down there, 70 odd or 70 or 80 odd years later, and what we can learn from that. So, and this is just an example here. This is our own photo scale. Here's a buried, rusted bolt that probably came out of the hydro plant number 2, which is up there in Francisco Canyon. The story they tell about that hydro plant is the one that was destroyed. It's been rebuilt. You go see it, beautiful Art Deco building, because it was rebuilt in 1929, 1930, right Art Deco time. It was structure, 3-story concrete structure, completely obliterated. But the turbines were still in place. And they were still spinning because the water was still trickling down. But there was no lubrication. They had a gravity flow system that oils the turbines, so that had been removed. So when they came down and looked down at it, they were glowing hot. So you're looking down off the hill, dam is gone, and there are these screaming, glowing turbines. The only thing moving in the whole landscape. What a powerful image that is. All right. Some of that. Lots of pieces of concrete. I didn't say something. Let me point this back to you. This is basically 2/3 of a mile down canyon from the dam. That's a piece of the dam. It's as big as a house. And that gives you an idea for the forces involved. That's a lot of it. There were others that blew up and this kind of delay. That one is pushed over. You can see sort of this is the front of the dam. It's had these little shells on it. Just kind of flip over. So big things like that. Lots of concrete the size of your toaster or whatever, 5, 6, 7 miles all the way down. Lots of debris like that. So we have pieces of dams, pieces of equipment. But there is also in that landscape signs of individual signs of humanity. So anybody give me a guess for what that is? That's pretty big. And that scale, these are 5 centimeter scales, right? So this is what? This thing's about, almost a meter across. What would that be? I we had a long debate about this. This is not my expertise, right? So it's a bedstead. So this would have been, these knobs would have been vertical things like this. This is the end of a bed. It was in one of those houses that was destroyed. And you can imagine that maybe there was somebody sleeping in that bed when this all happened. It brings it home, right? It's an artifact that brings the catastrophe home. And much more clearly than these kind of abstract ideas about sort of horrible stories. Things like that. There's other things we find in there. Things, signs of humanity in the wreckage. Well, we're working up there. We're actually going to go up there again in the fall and do some more of that. There's a car right there. It's a little car. And every 10 years, it gets dug out of the canyon and rolled down farther along, and no one quite knows where it is now. Everybody goes, oh, it's a car. We want to find a car. It's somebody owned in the disaster. But we're also concerned with the dead themselves. We've got their names, some things about their lives. We want to know as much about them as we can. There are lots of sources of this. We aren't digging up graves, okay? They're buried, unless we really need to. We don't want to disturb them. We don't disturb it up. There may be cases where we're asked to identify people, and that may happen. We've had a couple of those come by, but we have not ever felt like we had a good enough case to go to the county coroner and ask for it. We'll see, that might happen, but that's not something to do lightly, so we're cautious about that. We still find others, though. I've talked to archaeologists who in the last 20 years have seen human remains from in various kind of obscure ways and places. So like every once in a while, someone comes across a body that gets to be buried in certain way. Obviously, this practice goes. But there's a huge amount of archival stuff, and this is a book that comes from the Ventura Museum, from their library, which is the personal record of the Ventura County coroner, a guy named Oliver Reardon, It's his own personal book. It's called, you can't really see it, I think it's Violent Deaths, Curious Deaths. Coroner's Record, Violent Deaths. It's 1926 to 1940 when he ran a funeral home in Ventura, still got his name. This is his own book in their library, and when you open the book, pardon me if anybody would rather not see the dead, pictures of the dead. And pictures of people who are just dead, and then by 1939 or 1940, it's just bones as it goes on that way. Detailed records kept of the casualties as they were found, who they looked for, where they found them, what they liked, what the condition was, what their family had to say. An incredibly rich record, grim, rich record about them. There's also there's records from the LA County Coroner, there's a big coroner's report, lots of stories about dance halls getting turned into morgues for periods in the Happyland Dance Hall, and Newhall becomes a morgue for a long time. There's sorts of local stories about that. So you've got the dead, recovering the dead, dealing with the dead. You've got funerals and lots of records. Lavos does some interesting things with the funerals, talking about that. That whole aspect of after the disaster. Because one thing that we often find is that people forget about it. It's all about the horror of people dying, and then, then what happens next? How do you recover the dead? Where do they go? Where are they buried? Buries pays for them to be buried. How are they commemorated? This is all part of the discussion. There's also a really poignant file of information in the Museum of Ventura from people who thought that they might have lost a loved one in this disaster. So they would send, this is a description of a child who the coroner's notes about looking for a particular 6-year-old to see if they, if they found some unidentified remains. This particular kid was one that they had information for. This is a dental record that was sent by someone from the East Coast who said, "Dear Coroner Reardon, I have lost track of my brother, who was rumored to be looking for work in Southern California a couple of years ago. I'm afraid that he might be wanted or dead. Here is his dental records," if that helps you. And this mute, in this case, is when this was one of the guys or not. We don't know the end of this. They're dead. And the tales that they tell, but also the living telling tales about the dead. Maybe all of you know that Newhall was a big center for cowboy movies, and there's a lot of scene up here. This is a little monument that was put up in the cemetery by one of the famous cowboy actors of the day. This is kind of a stage shot of the Newhall cowboys saying goodbye to the casualties of the disaster. So it's kind of mourning, but it's almost like a promotional kind of mourning. Like doing some things, interpret that as you like. Lots of ways to do it. How about the living, okay? Because they're still there. There's still thousands of people living around that are affected by this disaster who didn't die. Maybe they lost family, but they didn't. Maybe they lost land. Maybe they lost orange groves and houses and livestock and what have you. One of the really interesting sources of information, this is an Apollo from the air right after that. This is the water gone. It's all soaked in. It's a big mess. Big muddy debris. It's hard to imagine this. So once I was driving, actually, when I was at Bardsdale Cemetery, they were chopping down one of the orchards there as they do, remove the trees. And let's get a picture of this. This is just a big pile of slash from clearing the orchard. Imagine the whole valley filled with those. Because that's what it was like. When that water was coming down the valley in the dark, it wasn't water. It was debris. If anybody's ever seen a flash flood, I've seen little flash floods, and it's always, you expect, it's like pine cones and branches and junk being washed ahead. This is cows and trees and houses and coming down the valley in the dark like a wall. And the water drops, all this stuff gets dropped and everything. So it's just incredible chaos left behind on the land, and the people who survive have to deal with it. Well, there are lots of angles on this, but I bring one up just because there's some some very interesting things. And this, I think, Lagos is one of our sources. What happens to the refugees? How are they taken care of? Santa Paula had more than one refugee camp. They were segregated. So there was a camp for Mexicans, Mexican Americans, a camp for everybody else, which tells us a certain thing about what's going on in that valley at that time. Not a surprise. What an interesting sort of socio-economic thing to think about. We learn a lot about that, not through the LA Times, but through the Spanish language sources from the valley. They tell us a lot about that. Well, there's some interesting angles there that I won't take much more of your time, so we can talk about it at another point. We got very interested in compensation because the Department of Water and Power really quickly said, no, we don't want this to get out of hand. We've got to, we've got to pay these people out. I don't necessarily put a negative slant on that, but they knew that they were on the hook. So their goal was to get on that fast, run around, make deals with people, and give them written checks, and then we can move on, right? Well, one of our assumptions was that we would see patterns of bias in compensation. And where we could look was back at the Department of Water and Power's archives, because these 40 file boxes we had were all claims files. And those claim files looked like this. This is from the family of Fred Salala, and they listed everything that they owned. I know what was in these guys' houses down to the last pair of socks in their drawers, which is an amazing thing, sociologically, right? Amazing thing to know what they, we're going to do some stuff with this kind of interesting database, if you like, about life in rural Southern California and what people own. But in fact, once we ran the numbers, we found that the average compensation amount for people who self-identified as Mexican or Mexican American was actually higher than the others. Why would that be? You know what? They lawyered up. So when the company agent came to the door, knocked on the door, says, here's your check, they knew it wasn't going to be right. Because they undoubtedly experienced that already. They said, no, we've got a lawyer. We call you. And it worked. So interesting, you have people think, oh, these poor guys out there in the rural farm, what they know, they knew plenty, right? They knew plenty, and they took action. So that's the kind of thing you learn about when you start to look at the survivors and what happens to them. This is an amazing logic. Finally, in this quick tour, memory. And this is really hot right now. Memory. How was this disaster commemorated? In fact, I'm going to get back to the beginning. Her master's thesis was all on memory commemoration. Well, sure, there are a few sort of quasi-official monuments. Not much. Not much. This is the California State Historic Plaque. It was built in 1977, so it's not very old. This is behind a fence, up on a power plant, up in the valley. No one ever sees it. I mean, in Francisco Canyon. This is a little monument that was put up by the National Forest guys. They have a firehouse there for forest fires. They just did that themselves. There's no official memorial. Interesting question is why not? Why not? Well, maybe, people, maybe he didn't want to be remembered. Maybe people who experienced it just wanted to get over it, right? Maybe people who caused it, that was okay with them. Okay? Complicated story if you went by just the official monuments. But if you go by the more vernacular monuments, cemeteries, you see a very different story. This is the Ruiz Cemetery. It's right downstream from the dam. Among other people there were members, the 6 members of the Ruiz family. This has been occupied cemetery. It used to be 1860s. It's an old time local cemetery up there. And here's the Ruiz monument for the last of the Ruiz family. All the casualties in there. In those cemeteries, like the one at Bardsdale I mentioned to start this with, there are stories about the dead, commemorated in different kinds of ways. Not everybody, lots of these graves are unmarked. And that's one of the reasons. But it's out there. Down this way, In Santa Paula, they're unmarked. It's sort of it's not a mass grave, but there's a whole, the area of the cemetery where they buried dam victims is not marked. So not too long ago again, a plaque was put up in 2004 to remember them. This is the Ida Cemetery right over here in Ventura, also unmarked up against the back wall. So if you're ever in Ida Lawn, for whatever reason, we go to our archaeologists all the time. Up here. That's where they are. And there's not a sliver of a sign there that that's where they were buried. Some remembered, some forgot. There were groves of trees planted in their memory that have matured, grown up, and cut down. That's all forgotten now. There were local plaques. Schools had plaques put on the walls. There was a bell in the school in Newhall. They rebuilt the schools. Put the bell down, put it in the basement, no one knew where the bell was for, and now it's all gone. So that the fact that we now see that it wasn't remembered doesn't mean that it wasn't remembered 50 years ago and commemorated. It speaks somehow to the persistence of memory, or the lack of persistence of memory in the landscape. Now, folks up in Santa Clarita now are trying to get this made a national memorial. Trying to get that commemorated in an official kind of way. And that requires congressional legislation, and that's what they're working on. But they see that as the solution to this forgetfulness problem. I don't know, I'm a little more skeptical about this. And sometimes that makes a difference. To wrap up now, here's a scene in the aftermath of the disaster. You can look at these things in various ways. What happened to them? What did Mulholland do? What's going on in Sacramento and LA City Hall, and all these power centers and things that created this bigger landscape of devastation? You can look at it. Mulholland. People to work with. A lot to look at there, actually, a lot of interesting stories. What we are, though, is we're looking at these guys, and we're imagining what their experience was like. We're looking at the evidence of their lives, documentary, factual, things that will tell us more of the story that's been unveiled before, and our evidence is productive in that case. We're not the only ones who are involved with this, though. This is one of the critical points of this kind of work, is that we are essentially at the nexus of a large community of stakeholders. Okay, on the one hand, there's the official stakeholders, the national forest, the people who are responsible for curating these, the range themselves, the range, the dam, and things like that. They've got their own management interests. You've got the local community members, people. These are people from Santa Paula who have commemorated this in Santa Paula in certain ways. The historical societies up and down the valley, there's very active in Santa Clarita, they see it their own way. Very few of the descendants of the victims are sort of around and engaged, which is interesting. A few, not many. Most of them moved on with their lives, gone off and different places. Although we get phone calls sometimes. But the few that are around are also part of this. You guys, in many ways, are stakeholders. In place of you, I've got some of my students from CSUN in that this is the heritage of the landscape of Southern California. And how these kinds of events, episodes, historical moments are remembered and what they mean is very much our collective heritage. Wherever people's families come from, wherever they go back here a long way, somewhere else, who can say? But this is the story of the land in this way. So we're all involved in this as well. And one thing the historic archaeologists are really keen on is bringing that, creating opportunities for engaging those different kinds of audiences. Because of course it's not about the dead, it's about the living. But it is true, despite all that, despite saying that we always pause in the middle of these projects, and we're kind of joking along. We've got what we did with the concrete and rebar and weird stuff all day. We're fooling around with skins and things. You kind of make light of it and kind of joke along how we get through these things. But we always try to pause and think about people like the Carrillo family. We commemorated it here in Barsdale. who have their own voice here, but one of our major endeavors is to help give voice to the rest of their experience and the experience of their neighbors, so that that they are there for us and also for our own. Thanks very much.
Questions for a few minutes. I do want to let everyone know we have a white piece of paper over there and a pen. And we would love your thoughts on the ways we can improve this kind of experience going forward as we do this lecture series. But please, if you have any questions for Dr.
Happy to
Snead.
take questions.
What year was the, is it called if there's a statue of the motorcycle?
Yeah, the statue of the motorcycle. That was like 2007, so it's quite recent. It's interesting how the modern commemorations go. In Santa Paula, people have seen this, it's called the Warning. And it's two life-size motorcycles with police officers in their 1928 year, because one of the stories about the catastrophes, by the time you got that far downstream, people got word out. Water isn't moving that fast. And so they called and they ran zooming down the valley in the motorcycles with their sirens blowing, warning people. So so in that case, what they've commemorated is not the dead, but is the sort of the heroism of people in that landscape who prevented there from being more casualties. So go to the cemetery, there's that little plaque, you know, if you're down in town, you can look at it as kind of an interesting, different version or different way to remember the cemetery. Yeah.
So I can't believe how much Santa Clarita has changed over the. So are there any safeguards in place to preserve or to do archaeological work prior to a new sub-development being born in Santa Clarita that you are able to take advantage of and
Yeah.
see some of our archaeological?
You know, it's funny because this is the kind of the classic archaeological thing. Development goes on. We're interested in that minutiae, right? And it's all over the place, right? And there are legal protections, but for the kind of evidence that we're looking at, in this sort of ephemeral scattered stuff, it's essentially not. Because it doesn't rise to the level of standard that would allow for small unit to happen. But of course, for our purpose, a lot of places we're looking are not buildable anyway. They're down in the channel, right? So in fact, a big chunk of this is on the national forest, and that doesn't get developed anyway. So that, you know, opportunities are undoubtedly being lost, but in fact, there's plenty to do. There's plenty to do in places where it's not very good. You know, if anybody ever gets a job at Magic Mountain for the summer, there was a bridge right behind the employee parking lot at Magic Mountain that was obliterated during this thing. Still down there. You walk down the hill, there's this big abutment, you know, a couple of pipes in there now, but that was never rebuilt. So they know it takes a lot of money to blow it up, so there it is. So there are these kind of things.
How about where Cairo, where the medicine workers were camped?
Well, you know, that's a tale unto itself. The locale of the landscape which suffered the greatest loss of life was at a place called Kent, which was a railroad siding right just a little bit to the east of Pyro. And it was the location of a work camp of young men who were installing high wires for Edison. And they didn't get the word. They were in tents. And unfortunately, the geology right there is such that the canyon narrows down again. So there's kind of a little intrusive ridge that comes across. So when that water hit that thing, it swirled back around, and they didn't have a chance. 118 of them drowned. Huge, big, single disaster. When we first started this project, that aspect of the disaster was our highest priority. Because we were very focused on the dead and the possibility of recovering human remains. Let us say that we had never been able to achieve access to that property. It's owned by Newhall Ranch and Cattle. I mean, they can sort of do what they want to. And it's our, and they, you know, what they tell us, and fair enough, they say, you know, we use a lot of pesticides down there, it's not a very safe environment, it's agriculture, and we're thinking like, yeah, but people are working in those fields, right? So what are you saying? My theory is they know there's stuff out there. And they know, and if you find a bunch of human remains somewhere on that, it's going to all be a big deal, right? So they have not seen it.
Was it to the north of the 126?
No, it's south. It's between 126 and the river. So it's basically, and I took me a long time to figure this out. It's not a sign of it now, right? It's that you're coming from you're coming from the west, you go right by Rancho Pinuelos, and you kind of go up over a little ridge and then down again, and it's, and the highway turns over to the left and straightens out. It's all that land in the highway and the river, right down there. Yeah, we really worked on that, for a while, and finally, because eventually maybe we had to do it, right? I don't want to make them mad by bugging it, but
I didn't, because I don't really know much about the area at the time, but what was the general population? Because I'm having a hard time picturing the exact level of impact of the community.
It differed depending on where you were in the battle. So at the top, there were, small ranches, except for the installations associated with the dam itself and the hydro plants. Little small ranches, small families, down almost to right to the edge of what is now Santa Clarita. There was, right there was a bigger ranch that was owned by a cowboy movie star, and Harry Jr. Had a big ranch there. Lost a lot of his property, a lot of his staff got drowned in this. Farther down, because Santa Clarita itself wasn't there at all. But farther down, there was the ridge route, the highway crossed there, the highway bridges, and there were little cabin camps along the highway there at what's called Saugus Junction, which is not the same as Saugus where the McDonald's and stuff is up on Red Hughes Road. In fact, Saugus Junction was right there, kind of where you make the turn, where you turn on Santa Paula, right there in that spot. So, and it's still rural, but it's more farming country farther downstream until you get to Piru, and you've got citrus, and you've got people out there. They have small houses and things, but also bigger villages. Santa Paula's obviously a big place in there. But Santa Paula is sort of upslope from the river, right? So the lower elevation of Santa Paula was flooded, but like downtown it didn't, right? So uphill it was different. And then down, the water was pretty not devastating right close to the tour because the drainage is pretty wide down there, right? But also caused some havoc, which is massive. So it's good, demographically it's complicated. Mexican, Mexican-American, there was actually one Japanese man who's buried right over here in the Japanese cemetery. Later on, there were lots of Filipinos on those fields, but it doesn't seem that there were any that identified themselves as such there at the time they were killed. So, but it's an interesting process. They could be available, but it's not very easy. Department of Water and Power obviously is sensitive about a lot of this stuff, but in terms of general genealogy, it's not a very accessible work. So it's not well indexed, and so it really is where they've got the argument coming. I mean, you go in there and it just goes on for miles. And some of that stuff they really don't have much to on. So the collection that we could use was pulled together for various reasons, years ago. And so it's funny, because when we went in and talked to the archivist, he was sort of looking in the sky, listening to us, and he said, so what do you imagine that we could use in relation? He said, whoa, something like news records? Yes. Yes, that's it. So they let us in like that little tiny way. So we knew about that. We know about some of the things. We worked with them off and on. They've given us some broader kinds of things. But it's not a warm and fuzzy research. And I think one reason why that is that they kind of keep under the radar down here a little bit. I never talked to anybody else in PWP except for the archivist and one librarian who wasn't on speakerphone. Yeah, I think they did, actually they did. I think the DDP is notoriously closed. We have various institutional outreaches at CSUN we try to do, and DWP is like a lot. Every time you say, hey, do you know anybody at DWP, they can listen to me. So do you have another question? Was that good? Yeah.
Let's maybe one more, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah.
How long did it take you to figure out the count of the 425?
About a year and a half. One of the things that made that part of the project really quite successful is that Anne is she's like a stakeholder in Find a Grave. Don't know Find a Grave? It's an online thing. Well, you ever didn't know where someone's buried? Find a Grave. And it's this national network of cemetery specialists. And she'd done this for years. And so she said, I'll find it. And they put out an EPB. Can someone in, Tulare County go out to XYZ cemetery and see if they can find the grave of so-and-so? You got the desperate boom, and they'll write back and say, yes, we did. Yes, we did. And so she worked it that way. They also, she's really familiar with the Mormon genealogical stuff in Salt Lake, and had done a lot of her own research on that, so she knew that whole system. So with all these things cross-referenced, and she and her whole family was crying away on stuff. And that's a lot of work, but it's there, right? It's not not a lot of paper records, right? It was all pretty digital. You just have to know where to look.
I just wondered if that was nationwide.
Yeah. Findgrave.com. It's kind of amazing. I'm gonna go on there.
Yeah, I think I submitted, someone asked me to pick up a photo. I was in the New York area.
Sure.
And there was like a Jewish cemetery.
Yeah, well, they do. It's really quite amazing. Her early work was in family, old, abandoned farm cemeteries in Illinois. And she was just going from one to the next. And that was, in fact, proved to be fabulous training for this. In a sense, and I kind of wish she was here, in a sense, this project would have gone nowhere if I had said to her, hey, do you know anything about cemeteries? And she said, yes, I do. So it's really exciting.
So let's thank Dr. Snead for speaking.
Well, it's always so interesting, like, even if you kind of know a bit about something, but then all the levels that can go into it, and every time you look at something, other things show up that branch off. Yeah.
You haven't actually said that, right? They found out something. It's different than what